Welcome to Recombination Nation. My guest today is from just across the pond in New Zealand. Nathan Surendran has been making waves lately with his consistently excellent Substack posts about the impact of the unfolding energy crisis on New Zealand, which I think is uniquely vulnerable among industrialized nations. And I'm very I'm very hopeful we're going to have an amazing conversation about all of the work that he's done on that front. But let's start off by talking to Nathan about like who he is. I like to start these conversations like paint a picture of who you are and like what what is it about you that allowed you to like become obsessed with energy systems and resource limits, whereas most people like learn a little bit about it and they just instinctively look away and like don't want to know anymore.
Okay. Well, thanks first for having me on, Shane, and for all of your hard work over the years with your blog. The Zero Input Agriculture blog is just a fascinating piece of thinking. And as I was saying to you just before we started, I feel like although I haven't been doing that stuff myself, just learning through osmosis with the stuff you're doing is amazing. So really great to talk to you today. And a bit about me. So I'm I guess, in these sorts of conversations, I sometimes refer to myself as a recovering professional engineer. So, my dad was an engineer. My grandfather on my mum's side was a electrical engineer, and I sort of got talked into the engineering route by my dad on the basis that, oh, that's a good career, isn't it? There'll always be demand, and certainly there is demand for the heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems engineering that I do. So I did a degree in building environment engineering, which is really building physics, and sort of started with building scale energy flows and then broadened my interest over time to larger scale energy flows, and particularly the sort of global flows. I'm not really an analyst in the classical sense of doing a lot of analysis myself. I'm more of a synthesizer. So I read widely and always have done, and since about 2008-9, when I both simultaneously got chartered as a professional engineer and also realized that engineering was probably as much a part of the problem as it was part of the solution, in the context of, it's engineering that's enabled industrial society to scale in the way it has. I was actually, my initial professional experience was for a company in the UK, which at the time was called Hoare, Lee and Partners, Hoarelea and Partners, and now just called Hoare Lee. And one of their founders, Edwin Hoare, was the chap in the Industrial Revolution who coined the phrase consulting engineer, which is, sort of that distinct sort of professional, theoretical, physics-based approach to designing energy systems rather than, the more sort of empirical, hands-on. And obviously there's significant overlap between these, kind of intuiting your way through experimentation and what works and what doesn't. So, yeah, I had that background on the sort of theoretical side of things, scaled my thinking from that small scale, sort of building scale energy flows up to the broadest sort of flows that exist around the world of energy. And as part of that, I guess I've always had a sense that there are issues with industrial society, and I don't know that many people haven't got some sort of sense of that there's something here that we're doing that we could probably be doing differently. But with that theoretical lens, I've been able to couch that in terms of energy flows. And I was just listening to that excellent interview that Nate Higgins did with Tad Patzek this last week, was released this last week. And in that, he talked quite significantly about actually its power. It's the ability to deliver energy at a particular rate, which is the constraint. And I think that's helpful to remember that in the conversation that we're going to have. I took that information and just kind of followed it through to its logical conclusion in my mind. And I guess more recently, a piece of knowledge that I've come to, which I think puts the question you asked about why I've been able to focusing on this, where other people look at it and look away, is an understanding of neurodiversity and potentially, sort of, I guess you'd say, an autistic take on the world, which really, in this context, what I mean by that is I've often had people say to me, you're very blunt and you're very, direct in the way you communicate, and I'm not sure I like that. It's often what people say about it, but in various ways they say that. But actually, just being able to sort of focus on this specific issue, both because I was doing it professionally, and then also became really obsessed with the idea of energy literacy and helping people to understand this. Back in 2008-9, I mean, some of the resources that really opened my mind to this was, in particular, Chris Martinson's Crash Course, which is, putting energy, economics, and the environment together in a way that really kind of transformed my perspective, both on my engineering activities in the professional sense, but also on the broader sort of systemic implications of energy constraints on economic activity and on our ability to continue with environmental impacts at the scale and at the pace that we've achieved, in inverted commas, in the last 150 years.
I've got a little anecdote on that Crash Course, which is still excellent. Like, it was made over a decade ago. I played that during a high school chemistry class because we had like a day spare, and I'm like, "Oh, this is really interesting." It was quite new at the time, and it was really fascinating watching cognitive dissonance in real time, as like these poor kids just couldn't take it in. Like, I asked them about like that process, and they were like, "Yeah, we kind of know it, and we don't want to think about it." Like, they were quite aware of their cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. It's something that I've said for a while now, is that actually the conservative sort of politically right-leaning perspective, which really, in a broad sense, wants things to kind of continue as they are, prefers business as usual because it recognizes all of the amazing material comforts that we have as a result of this way of life, and wants to sort of sustain and support and protect that. And when it's confronted with that sort of system synthesis and limits to growth thinking, basically turns around and goes, "No, F off, I don't want to think about that," is actually in many respects intellectually a more honest response than the idea on the sort of left-leaning side of the political spectrum of this net zero green energy transition. We can green the economy and keep going with it more or less as it is. And I understand within that there's a tactical thing of trying to meet people where they are and kind of create a narrative and a set of stepping stones away from the idea that business as usual is a possibility and that you have to start somewhere. And there's obviously some of that going on as well. But yeah, just in a broad sense, I think it's interesting to compare those two ways of resolving the cognitive dissonance. One just to basically turn away from the facts and prefer a fiction, and the other actually is pretty much the same thing. It's ignoring certain inconvenient facts around energy resource depletion and limits to growth to prefer this fiction of a green techno-utopian future that's much like the one that we have, just with lots of wind turbines and solar panels, right?
Oh, while we're talking about engineering, do you have any thoughts on the durability and the potential evolution of the engineering tradition in a world of diminishing resources? And does like ancient Rome give us any hints? Like, they were master engineers as a civilization, but they lost all of that for quite a long period of time.
I mean, one of the amazing things of this particular period is the internet and all of the knowledge that we have around those trends and how they've played out historically. I don't believe that in the last 250 years we have in any meaningful cognitive or evolutionary sense progressed in the way that some people seem to think we have, even leading to its sort of logical conclusion with the sort of transhuman agenda and the idea of, I mean, transhuman in the sense of transcending humanity and becoming one with a machine, not transsexual, just to
Yeah, yeah.
clear up that distinction. I think that people are generally, how would I say this? Sorry, engineers are typically, quite conservative by nature, and I mean that in the sense of, their professional opinions are very carefully stated positions as a result of the responsibility that they take on as professional engineers in designing these systems. And so I think that constrains both their ability to speak publicly and also, for fear of losing clients or losing professional credibility and these sorts of things. And it's something that I've really wrestled with because, when you speak to them privately, those who have been able to resolve some of the cognitive dissonance, do some of the what's effectively grief work around allowing yourself to accept some of the constraints which I believe we face, particularly from an energy perspective, and then to move into, okay, well, how do I respond to this from an engineering perspective? Those sorts of people are casting around and finding things like transition engineering, which an ex-colleague of mine, Daniel Kenning in the UK, and a professor of mechanical engineering who was at Canterbury, is currently over on the Isle of Skye, called Susan Crumdyke, have described. And that's an extremely, forward thinking. It's actually based on kind of the natural step process, if you're familiar with that at all. But it's this idea of thinking 100 years into the future, beyond any reasonable expectation of significant fossil fuel inputs, because whichever way you look at it, they'll be depleted by then. And starting with, okay, well, what are we aiming for at that point? What is a realistic, and doing some, exercises around what are the fundamental parts of civilization that we want to keep? What are the things that we could let go of? And then coming back and actually back casting from that future desired end state to the current position and discerning steps and stepping stones in that direction. And there's a growing number of people who are engaged with that. There's been some fantastic research and papers published around transition engineering. Encourage people to look it up. That's one of the sorts of responses that I think the engineering profession is making, sort of intuiting its way into what an engineering what professional activity in the engineering space would look like in a resource constrained future. I mean, the challenge there is the rate at which things are currently changing, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
With any of this stuff, if it would have been better if we'd taken the learnings that we already made as a society in the 1970s as a result of the oil crises then. The back to the land movement around that period was the largest internal migration of people in US history. And, it was pretty clear to me that that we should have continued on that path. Unfortunately, the neoliberal reforms of the early 80s as a sort of backlash against those constraints, and also, the sort of, I guess, broader agendas that are afoot in the world around these things led us in a very different direction. And so we've lost a lot of the time that we could have used to adapt. And so I think that the transition engineering model, whilst it gives some ability to do some of the thinking required, it also needs to sit alongside some, I guess, more gritty sort of realism sort of perspectives on this, which would include things such as triage of our existing systems. And there's a few thinkers who've sort of been speaking on that point. A local fellow, actually the deputy chair of the Wise Response Society that I'm chair of, Murray Grimwood, in New Zealand, has been writing about that quite, coherently for a while now, and just explaining to people and pushing for them to think in terms of, these are the systems we have. We don't really have time to engineer a whole new generation of systems. We probably don't have the energy and material resources to do that either, because, you know, the nature of the rebuildables, or renewables as they're commonly called, systems is that because they're harnessing diffuse energy, they're probably an order of magnitude in scale larger than the existing fossil fuel systems if we were to replace for like, and we simply don't have that much resource. Take away the inherent additional efficiency of energy systems, it might be a third of that, 10 times as big, so maybe only 3 times as big. Still, you know, well beyond, I think, what we can reasonably expect, and certainly in the timeframes we have. So we have to make do with our existing systems. What new systems we do have, I would really like to see engineering focusing more on systems that degrade gracefully. And so I'll give you an example of that in the off-grid house that I built here in Invercargill. We've got a relatively low energy house. It was designed using dynamic thermal simulation. You know, that's my background, so I was able to do that. And I looked at the house in terms of the energy systems and passive performance, as opposed to, you know, using active mechanical systems. And where I am using active mechanical systems, how can you use natural effects like buoyancy to drive heat transfer in such a way that it reduces your, you know, energy input required to maintain comfort conditions in that space. So what that means in practice is I have a wet back connected to a large thermal store, which is about 2,000 litres, and that uses a thermosiphon effect. So it uses just the buoyancy of the hot water in the wet back to move that water into the thermal store rather than actively pumping it. And with the photovoltaic system, and then that thermal store then gives off heat slowly, and it can be adjusted. The amount of heat loss can be adjusted simply by adjusting the amount of insulation that is exposed on one side of the thermal store, and there's an air path up to high level within the space where that warm air can rise and kind of work its way down to the back end of the house. And then I just have a single ceiling fan, you know, a little 12 volts one, which runs on maybe 5-10 watts of electrical energy, which can then push that warm air down at the far end of the house, and that cool air slowly finds its way, you know, as it warms the space and cools, it drops down to low level, and there's a low level intake which then passes that air back across the thing. So it's a passively designed system with a very minimal requirement for mechanical input. Similarly with the photovoltaic system, you know, I went with a nickel ion battery technology, which is a very old, you know, Edison batteries, which they're a pain to maintain. You know, it's like the old lead acid batteries. You've got to top them with distilled water, and not so bad on the balancing front. They're a bit more tolerant to that and general abuse. But one of the things I like about them is because they're a bit more tolerant of abuse, in say 10, 15 years, when the inverters come to the end of their life and you can't get the replacement parts to you know, or potentially can't get the replacement parts for them, I can take the the inverter, the sort of complex electronics out of the system, and just have a simple manual contactor. I've configured the voltage of the solar strings so it's around about 80 volts DC. The battery bank runs between about 40 and 65 volts DC, and so I can just make a direct connection and charge those batteries. It's not an ideal situation, but it will work. You know, people have done this in the past with simple situations like that. So you still have the ability to charge the batteries. You then can see, you know, tapping off the 48 volt battery bank at different voltages and being able to run, you know, battery tools well past their ability to use the lithium ion batteries that eventually degrade within them direct from the battery bank and so on. So, you know, there's things like that that can be done just at the small scale. And then obviously you can apply that sort of general principle of how can we get the system to sort of keep functioning in some sense without, you know, necessarily the direct electronics control. Yes, it's a lot more labor intensive. You've got to manage it much more actively, but we can still leverage the advantage that these mechanical and electrical systems gives us without necessarily requiring all of the high-tech components that we have currently. So yeah, I think that's some of the thinking that needs to be out there around engineering. It's a really interesting question, actually, and thank you for asking. Nobody's asked me about that before.
Well, another thing I've picked up with the engineering tradition is that they think about failure modes, like they look at a
Yes.
design and work through all of the possible ways that it can, come apart or collapse in on itself.
Mm.
And I wonder how much that has been done for our kind of unsexy industrial infrastructure, our reticulated water, our roadworks, like
Yeah.
from an energy and resource limit perspective.
It's challenging. I mean, I've engaged with the Infrastructure Commission here in New Zealand and with local councils and authorities around, some of the infrastructure spend and so on, and made submissions to them over the years. And basically what I'm saying is, from the set of starting conditions, the sort of terms of reference of what you're doing, which assumes continued function of industrial society, I have no doubt that you're doing the best that you can be. However, here's an alternative perspective, and shouldn't we at least consider what would happen if we couldn't get spare parts and if we couldn't do these things?
Yeah.
And so, in the context of the immediate crisis, what that's looked like from my perspective is going to local authorities and saying, well, look, have you at least gone away from the sort of lean manufacturing models, or lean business models, which were being promoted around, holding minimum stock and so on, and moved to a more resilient model where actually you recognise that some of the capital that you have invested, and this question came up in the conversation I had with the Southland District Councillors a couple of weeks back. One of the councillors asked this question. I thought it was really good. Have you considered taking some of the invested money that you have and using it to hedge against future price hikes or unavailability of the spare parts and chemicals and so on that you require to run, for example, your three waters infrastructure, your freshwater supply, wastewater treatment systems, and stormwater drainage, and actually build up a stockpile of spares such that in the disruptions that we can see coming, that you've actually put in place some strategic buffers in terms of the systems that you're being asked to manufacture, manage and maintain, operate and maintain, such that we aren't going to see, for example, disruptions to the reticulated water supply, which even in a small, reasonably well spread out city like Invercargill, would potentially be quite problematic because we don't have much in the way of on-property rainwater storage as a buffer, for fresh water supply if the mains do go down. Because one of the problems that we have with engineered systems is if they're functioning well, no one sees them, and so you don't think about it, and you just assume you'll turn the tap on and there'll be water there. And the idea that that won't be the case is just not on a lot of people's radar. And so, part of the submission I made to the council as well was, there's been this ongoing discussion for years in Invercargill about what do we do for a second water supply, because we currently have one water treatment plant taking supply from one river, and that's the entire town potable water supply. If that fails, what is the second water supply? And so there's a business as usual thinking, large scale. We need to find a confined aquifer that we can draw from strategically for this purpose. And there's been lots of money and time spent on that. Been schemes to bring water from Lake Monowai, which is 130 kilometres away via a pipeline or something of that nature. All of these large scale, think big is the New Zealand term for it, which harks back to that time when neoliberal thinking, and think big projects like large scale hydro and stuff were built in New Zealand back in the 80s. Think big is an artifact of an age of plenty, an age of abundance, an age of cheap energy, and all of that is currently coming to an end. So we need to start thinking in terms of resilience and things like, why don't we just start encouraging people to put in some rainwater collection? It's a diverter on an existing downpipe which is already there, and a tank which can be as simple as a food grade IBC with some ply sheeting on it or corrugated iron to keep it dark and stop algal growth. And there you've got your resilient supply, right? So there's those sorts of simple things that can be done, which really
But they need to be
just
done before the crisis really unfolds.
well, yeah, ideally. But,
Mm.
I've been trying to think about, well, what can people do now and what can they get on with themselves ahead of this crisis? And, trying to push some of that thinking out there. And it's been, interesting to see that people have been engaging with it. Certainly, the document that we put out as Wise Response called When the Trucks Stop, which is, a result of conversations we've had over the last couple of years around, seeing this coming and kind of trying to figure out what to do about it, is just basically a very simple guide, and it's deliberately constrained to what are the basics you can do around things like water supply and food supply and so on.
Now, I want to get on to getting your view of the overall strategic position of New Zealand in a second, because
Mhm.
there's probably a lot of listeners who aren't aware of that situation. But before we do that, um, I'm just interested in this idea that you look at, grand cities like London and New York,
Mm.
they're built on infrastructure that was created in like the 1800s, during like late
Absolutely.
1800s, during
Yeah.
that, you know, kind of the peak of the coal boom.
Mm.
And as wealthy and as populous as they are, they're struggling to maintain that infrastructure, which is like over 100 years old, let alone expand it
Yeah.
significantly. And I just wonder if there's any broader lessons for that, even beyond big cities, like into smaller regional, uh, aggregations of people.
Lessons in what sense?
Uh, just a sense that, like, we're hitting a kind of oil inflection point,
Hmm.
but the cycle of resource constraints
Yes.
and disasters goes a lot further back if you look carefully. Like even World War
Right.
One, a lot of
Yeah.
that was about coal and
Mm.
its impact
Mm.
in the economy.
I see. Yeah. 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 I mean, so I think for people who tend naturally to think in systems, and I recognise that isn't everyone, apparently, although that's sort of news to me in some respects, even fairly recently. I just you've got a sample size of one, right, and you kind of assume that people are generally quite similar until you sort of dive into, like I said, the neurodiversity sort of um, framing of the human psychology and so on, and realize that actually no, there are some quite significant differences between people. So for those who tend to think in systems and have sort of identified those challenges, and all kinds of people right back to Jevons and Jevons paradox, and so on, like it's been pretty clear from one perspective that these things are a challenge, that we neglect them and fail to address them at our peril, and that we should be thinking about and doing things differently and accepting constraints. And then there's been this dominant narrative around, effectively we are as gods on the earth and we can do whatever human ingenuity conceives of. It's just a matter of time and the application of technology, and we're on this march to the stars. Yeah, and it's a very appealing narrative. I mean, I loved science fiction growing up. One of my favorite books was Robert Heinlein's Farmer in the Sky,
Hmm.
where it describes abilities to create an agricultural settlement on one of Jupiter's moons, and some of the challenges they encountered and so on there. And I mean, even there, the ultimate fix in the narrative is magical thinking, right? They discover some alien technology that allows them to keep going when their earthly systems fail, and so on. And
Mm.
so, there is a recognition in those sorts of things that there are limits, but people believe in magic, and this is something that is just the reality of the human condition. I think is that people want to believe in things that are beyond our immediate ability to rationally think about. And if you don't have an active faith and belief in a higher power in that sense, then you end up with, I think, what I've started describing as the civic religion of growth and progress, which is the dominant faith-based narrative of our time. with
Mm.
its high priests in the economics profession, and its dogmas of, substitutability of goods, and of technological progress and so on.
Mm.
And that is a that, when you start to engage with people and try and disabuse them of these beliefs, you realize that you are running up against religious ideology, and that the ability to counter that is limited, and so for people who, I think, see the challenges, the challenge to them then becomes to do what I believe your zero input agriculture is a really good example of, which is go ahead of where people currently are and effectively pave the way. In religious terms, you could call it an apostolic calling.
Yeah, yeah.
To actually be out there saying, look, here's an alternative way of doing things. And I mean, what we know from history about people who've done that is that it's quite easy to turn a population against those people and to demonize them and ostracize them as being different and being inconvenient to, just living peacefully and, business as usual and all the things that human society as a whole seems to sort of tend towards.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, it's an uncomfortable place to be, right? But I think that is the work, is getting people to see an alternative and getting enough people around you to be able to create small working examples of what the larger system might look like over time, so that as the existing functions of the larger system start failing to meet people's needs and they're casting around for alternatives,
Mm.
you have something to put in front of them that isn't just, neo-feudalism and Mad Max, right?
Yeah, yeah. This would be a great chance to give us your overview of the strategic position of New Zealand in response to this unfolding oil shock. Because I think it's got a lot of, it has an image about what it is, and then there's a reality behind that that most people around the world don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, let's start with that image of how New Zealand talks about itself in the mainstream sort of media discussions of what New Zealand is. People talk about New Zealand Inc. We are a country that seems to have a very powerful neoliberal consensus in the general in the general public setting around how we organize ourselves, what our ambitions are. From the agricultural sector, which is one of the primary generators of export receipts for New Zealand, we have a dominant narrative that New Zealand is feeding the world. We've got 5 million people and we produce enough food for, what is it, 30-40 million people, with our, in calorific terms, with our exports of primarily milk powder and also meat from cows and sheep and deer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of the narrative that we have culturally. And what I've realized as I've applied this energy lens to our economy and sort of started to unpick what constraints on energy supply mean, is that in the broadest sense and in the sort of big picture, that there's some absolutely fantastic people like Tim Morgan of the Surplus Energy Economics blog talk about energy is the economy, and energy flows are fundamental to any economic activity. And in this industrial society, it's fossil energy that is the main workhorse, for all our efforts to improve renewable energy resources in New Zealand and globally. I mean, New Zealand, because of the Think Big project of the 1980s, was blessed with quite a significant hydroelectric resource. And so, we say something in the region of 80 to 85% of our electricity generation is from renewable sources, and that figure is going up over time, as is the total amount of electrical energy we use relative to other fuels, and particularly now with this oil shock, and also the reality of our depleting gas fields. So, the North Island of New Zealand has had quite a lot of industrial activity and also home heating and cooking and so on, driven by reticulated gas supply from the Maui field and others in the Taranaki region, which is the sort of west side of the North Island, around Mount Taranaki. And that's piped up to Auckland, our largest city, and feeds various industrial processes, dairy dryers and tunnel houses and the like on the way. All of that is now starting to decline. The gas situation has been headline news in New Zealand for about the last 3 years, because we hit that inflection point in supply, where your supply reaches its peak and then starts to decline, and that decline is accelerating, as you expect from that sort of roughly bell-shaped distribution curve over time. And the reality of that is that the last of the gas has been announced sort of within the next couple of years now. There's been a nationwide announcement in recent weeks saying basically we're done. There's no more gas after this point. The wells won't support it, and we're just going to have to do something else. And so the government looks at that and goes, well, we need liquefied natural gas because we can't just replace all that immediately. And so they want to spend $1 billion on that. And people who are thinking about this and thinking about actually what would help in the face of broader energy constraints, like myself, are saying things like, well, actually, if you spent that $1 billion on photovoltaic and battery systems for rooftops around New Zealand, you could put a sort of 5-ish kilowatt system, maybe 5 kilowatt hour battery, on the rooftops of the poorest 5% of houses in New Zealand, and that would have a massive socio-economic benefit. It would create this distributed energy system. So again, as these larger scale systems like the grid, like the gas reticulation, fail over time in response to constraints which we can't get around, then at least you've got some distributed energy. Obviously, electrical energy is quite high exergy. It does a lot of useful work, and can be used to support I guess you'd say, a slightly softer landing for society. And I look with envy at what Australia has achieved in that regard. It's by no means an answer to the resource constraints we face, but the 40% rooftop solar penetration or whatever that's been achieved in Australia, and now the literally tens of thousands of batteries that have been installed in the last year or two, as this sort of shock that we're currently experiencing increases in duration and frequency, which is the only path available going forwards on the basis of the resource depletion curves that we're on, then Australia will be very grateful for that work that has been done. And New Zealand, if it were, if it had any sense collectively, would be doing that same sort of thing. So, underlying all that, there's some, stuff around monetary theory and so on, which I'm not an expert on, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about because of the linkage between economy and energy. And modern monetary theorists and so on point to the ability of government to sovereign money printing and so on, in the way that can actually support economic activity. An Australian professor of economics, Steve Keen, is very good at explaining that, and I've used his work a lot in my submissions and thinking. And there's also the reality that in 1989 New Zealand introduced what's called the Public Finance Act, where we actually have a prohibition, incredibly, in legislation against New Zealand's government exercising the right to sovereign money creation and saying instead New Zealand Inc. or New Zealand as a country will borrow money from private banking institutions to fund government activities, rather than using the other mechanisms that are available through the sovereign money creation mechanism, the issuance of bonds and so on, which allow it to be, I won't say fiscally neutral, because actually it drives a lot of economic benefits when you actually have a government that's exercising that right and is able to fund infrastructure projects and create liquidity in the national system in a way that the existing arrangement really doesn't. There's this narrative in New Zealand, I don't know, it's probably the same in New Zealand, that the economy must be run like a household. This idea that microeconomic thinking scales up to macroeconomics, and the two are kind of analogous with each other, when really they're not, because in a sense, a nation state can't really go bankrupt if it can keep printing. I mean, there'll be inflationary effects, and you reduce the value of money in terms of its export ability and so on. But in terms of its sustaining the velocity of money, which is an important thing as we enter a downturn, and I mean, this is going to be the mother of all downturns, as far as I can tell. And get to this place where we need to support money flows, even without necessarily the energy flows that underpin economic activity. Just having money available to facilitate trade at a local level wherever you can move goods and services around. For one, bearing in mind, most of the settlements of New Zealand, possibly with the exception of Wellington and Auckland, which are quite landlocked and not so connected to agricultural regions directly in parts, and the scale of them. You can see in other parts of New Zealand this exchange between rural and urban areas where farmers are constrained their ability to export or to get milk off farm and to the dryers, because there's constraints that are potentially going to be impacting those locations. And so instead, you can set up local trade arrangements and facilitate some economic activity at the scale that you can achieve with a limited amount of diesel, whatever that ends up being. And I mean, that's a really interesting question, is how big an impact is this actually going to have, and what's the flow on sort of second and third order effects in terms of fertilizer supply, agricultural outputs, ability to export, etc. All of which I think are becoming apparent to a lot of people in the ministries and the positions of power within the New Zealand government, the decision makers. But it's so foreign to their native mode of thinking and to their, as I was saying before, religious beliefs around the market will provide, that people are really struggling, I think, to make the conceptual leap to the sorts of things that I'm talking about in terms of how we must, if we're to have better societal outcomes, shift our thinking and our strategic use of the monetary system, of our what natural resources we do have to support better outcomes in country, because increasingly, and this is what this oil shock has really highlighted for people, New Zealand is at the end of some very long, very fragile supply chains. And I say fragile not in the sense that they have proven brittle in the face of the shock, because they haven't, but maybe a tenuous would be a better word. We rely on imported refined products, because a few years ago our only refinery shut down. And there's lots of talk in New Zealand about why that was the case. Was it a sort of a failure of governance at the national level to realise the strategic importance of it? There's some truth to that. Was it a failure of New Zealand Inc. to support overseas oil companies to come and do more exploration? I mean, if you listen to people from within the oil industry in New Zealand that are talking about this, they saying, we spent, and this is a global phenomenon, again, this isn't local, we spent the last 10 years burning through exploration budgets and coming up empty. There simply isn't the oil to discover, or where it is discovered, like in South Australia, there's this shale resource which is apparently the same size as Gawar in Saudi Arabia. It's impossible to extract because of geological constraints, because of fracking is a massively water intensive proposition, and there just isn't the water in the locations where the shale rock is. That seems to be the same in China. And so we really we're at this weird place. It's weird where the thinking just has to shift, and it's so entrenched and so dogmatic that people just aren't yet. And I think that's the other thing, is people just aren't yet feeling directly enough pain for this to be, something that spurs them into action and to really casting around for genuine alternatives.
I mean, it's one thing, I think New Zealand has an advantage over Australia politically, that your geography is so constrained that the idea that there's these vast, oil and gas resources just waiting to be tapped and there's some evil person in an office preventing it from happening is less plausible. Whereas Australia, there's so much territory, there's
Yeah,
so much land that it's very easy to convince people that the resources
yeah,
are just there waiting. And it's
yeah.
very easy for politicians to sell that story to the electorate with
Mm.
promises that abundance is coming back,
It's
in no
interesting, though,
time.
that actually, although it is constrained by geography in the way you've described, that narrative is very strong in New Zealand. And, when
Ah,
I
okay.
look at comments on my podcasts, I've done a couple of podcasts with places like Reality Check Radio and so on, and more of the mainstream outlets as well. But in that forum in particular, there's lots of people who come back and say exactly what you're just saying there. That basically this is some sort of conspiracy to rob us of our right to these resources, and that they're being, there's a depopulation agenda, and all these sorts of things. And I have some sympathy for that if you take the view that business as usual is a possibility and that we're being constrained artificially by nefarious forces. But actually what I believe is really happening is that we are being constrained by natural limits, and we are casting around looking for someone to demonize and blame because we don't accept that those things are a reality, right?
Mm, mm. I wanted to highlight as well, New Zealand, I think, has the second highest amount of fertilizer applied per arable acre in the world. The only place that's higher is Hong Kong, and they don't have a lot
Yeah,
of arable acres to be pouring
yeah, yeah, yeah,
fertilizer
yeah.
onto. Have you looked into that potential vulnerability, given that export agriculture is such a huge part of your balance of trade?
I mean, in a general sense, I'm aware of that. Through Wise Response, we're concerned about the sort of planetary boundaries in that broader sense. And in terms of biogeochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen specifically, it's clear that the environmental impacts of that reality that you just described is having massive impacts on New Zealand's freshwater ecology, and it's something that is a concern in that regard. But yeah, from the perspective we're talking about it here, I just, again, people don't believe that absolute constraints on energy and therefore material throughput are actually real. They just don't accept that. And so the idea that these things could go away until you know late February, when this all kicked off, were basically seen as theoretical. Ah, Nathan, we hear what you're saying. Yeah, it's theoretically a risk, but really, we've had 40 years that have told us that this is fine and everything's fine, and we
Hmm.
haven't seen this sort of thing. And we can just keep going as we are. I mean, why wouldn't we? We're making a lot of money, and we that's the reality of it. And that again is tied not to farmers being uncaring people who just blithely apply fertilizer because they're profit oriented and everything be damned. It's they're constrained by their mortgages, the death grip that the financial institutions that have lent money to them to intensify their agricultural systems hold over them. And even within that, the banking consultants and stuff that I meet, and who are going out and farm and trying to push this sort of thing on to farmers, aren't necessarily bad people in and of themselves. They're just poorly educated and don't understand this bigger picture. And this is why I'm so passionate about energy literacy as the foundation of strategic planning going forwards, because
Mm,
if people continue to see those things as an option, which like I say, with an energy lens they very clearly aren't, then they will continue to plan in a direction that is increasing the brittleness of our economy, and not managing the risk of the type of shortfall that we are now on the cusp of.
mm.
Yeah.
Now, one topic I really want to talk about with you, you're unusual in this kind of peak oil awareness uh, community, that you are doing a lot of work petitioning government authorities, particularly local government authorities.
Mm,
And I would love to hear more about how they have been responding to your attempts to reach out to them and influence their thinking?
Yeah, so I'll start that with actually telling you why I do it because I think that's quite important. So back when I really kind of got my head around this, 15 years or so ago, and I'd moved to New Zealand in 2010 with a young family, and we'd settled in Invercargill. I read Dmitry Orlov's Five Stages of Collapse, Communities That Abide, and some of his other blog posts and so on. He was very good at I forget what his America book was called, but there was a book on his observations of the United States and the USSR as that went through its own collapse.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he said, which stuck with me, is that people who could have made a material difference in the USSR in terms of people who were seen as, the civic leaders, the captains of industry, the people who were successful and who people looked up to for leadership and so on, are just human beings ultimately. And as the level of economic collapse that occurred in the USSR unfolded, these people whose identity was built around their ability to command income and to put to control resources went away. They lost their identity because they lost the things that made them psychologically who they were. And as a result of that, a lot of them did not cope very well, and the majority of them, in his observation, basically drank themselves to death.
Mm.
So that's a real risk in every society, I think, as you go through this period. And one of the things that I strategically decided to do is start making these submissions primarily to central government and local government, but then hoping that the business community will pick up on them and read them as well. Because if you don't have any sense of there is an alternative way of looking at this that's got explanatory power and that gives us some options in terms of things that we can do differently, then you're stuck psychologically in this rut that you've been in for your entire career, and it's very, very hard to get out of it. So even if people feel around the edges of the elephant, kind of go, oh no, thank you, I'm not interested in thinking any more about that, at least they've thought about it at that point. And it's that inception, that planting of this idea that this is potentially coming, that these are potentially ways forwards from this point. And when you get to a shock like this and suddenly everyone wants to talk to Nathan because
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
been talking about this for 15 years, and oh, maybe we should be listening to him. It's really that was the sort of the framework or the thought that led me to think that making these submissions was a good idea, because I
Is it an
recognized.
example of psychological priming? Like, I think I've done this with
Yeah,
people
that
in
would
my
be. Yep.
community. I'll
Yep.
mention these things to them in a very brief, offhand way when there's no
Hmm.
disaster, and then just not talk about it again. But
Yeah.
you want them to remember it when a situation like this starts unfolding. They're like, oh yeah, somebody had a prediction and a framework for looking at these kind of things. Maybe
Yeah.
I should go and talk to them again now.
Exactly, and that's really, what I've been doing over the last 15 years of really getting very little in the way of response to the submissions I've made, both through the Wise Response Society, which is a NGO that I now chair, but I've been a committee member of for over 10 years now, whose basic question is, as demand for growth exceeds our physical limits, causing unprecedented risks, what knowledge and actions do we need to secure New Zealand's future well-being?
Mm.
So, in that context, obviously that's framed around a sort of ecological awareness. That our original chair, Sir Alan Mark, was one of the guardians of the lakes in Te Anau around Lake Manapouri and Lake Te Anau, and was instrumental in with that wider group of guardians in kickstarting the environmental movement in New Zealand. So a person who had a lot of mana or respect in New Zealand. And he and our patron for a while was Sir Geoffrey Palmer, who's one of the former prime ministers, again very deep thinker, legal expert, constitutional expert. We've got that sort of background of people who are taking a big picture view of New Zealand. And we made governmental submissions in response to consultations, tried to actively engage with ministers over respective governments over the last 10 years or so, and have had very limited success in getting the message out on an environmental basis, because there's just a muddying of the waters with all of the backlash against the climate change narrative. And be honest, the problems with climate change science and the way it's communicated, and also some of the constraints around it, that it's hard for people to get their heads around. And so in a general sense, I think we've tried to make these submissions. We've been met with limited success, but what we have done now is we've got this body of submissions on the Wise Response Society website, on my own personal blog, where I've collated some of the ones I've done individually, as a result of interacting with the various thinkers on the wider Wise Response mailing list, who have informed our submissions over the years. And we've actually we've got this body of evidence now over 15 years, basically saying, look, this is coming, we should do something about it. Here's some thoughts. Have you considered this? And and now it's all coming to a head. Hopefully that positions us so that we can actually push for strategic policymakers and so on, to say, look, we've been talking to you about this for a while now. Like, there's a whole variety of reasons why you haven't listened. It's water under the bridge as far as I'm concerned. Can we sit down and have a positive conversation about what to do next in the context that you now understand that we're operating on, which is the one that we've been talking to you about for the last 15 years.
Has the Maori indigenous parallel political structure been more receptive? I know down in Southland you're kind of away from the center of population of the Maori community.
Well, it's an interesting one. So Invercargill itself has a Maori population, something in the region of 8 to 10% of the population.
Okay.
So I won't say specifically Maori, but Pacifica. And that's a result of, there were lots of jobs, meatworks and, fishing and that sort of thing, which brought, people to the region historically. And so we've got quite a strong Maori community down here. But in a broader sense, I gave a short presentation to one of the local economic development agency forums about 6 or 7 years ago, and there's a leader of one of the local runako, which is one of the local tribal sort of subgroupings in the Southland region, a chap called Stuart Bull, and he came to me after the presentation. He said, what you've just said and described in terms of limits and the need to think long term and to prepare for constraints and so on. You've said it in scientific language, but that's basically the same thing that Maori are saying from their indigenous understanding of Earth systems. and so I think there is a big overlap between the sort of systems thinking perspective that is particularly in energy sense, the one that I represent, and then indigenous thinking about constraints on future economic activity, and the need to think in terms of resilience and optionality as much as efficiency and increases and growth. I think that the Maori, because they understand that, they have, for example, done far more thinking and work. And I'm not suggesting they're perfect, nobody is, but in terms of things like food sovereignty and local food resilience and what they call papakainga, which is the sort of communal gardening arrangements that ancestrally and historically produced food for Maori communities, and actually pushing into where there are larger Maori settlements in the North Island, into actually re-establishing those and looking at ways that they can not just benefit their people through the provision of healthy food from these systems, but also pushing into their indigenous knowledge of plants and looking at the medicinal use of plants and looking for ways to improve their economic situation through leveraging indigenous knowledge around that sort of thing as well. So I think they've done a fair job of all of that, and they are better positioned as communities. And there's another important thing which I think is really under discussed. Often in our society we talk from a sort of privileged white perspective, and I feel like I straddle that fence a little bit because I'm mixed race and all the rest of it, but I kind of present in that way. So I recognise. So, oh, aren't these poor people, struggling, and we should really help them, and oh, woe is them, and we have to have charity for them and all these things. And actually, in the context of current energy constraints and the changes that we're likely to see in the global economy, I keep hearing people say, oh, well, the wealthy will be all right, they've got all these resources that they've got to control. And I think that's fundamentally mistaken. If you think of it like climbing up a cliff, the further you climb, the further you have to fall. So in
Yeah.
terms of material standards of living, the more you're leveraging energy and resource throughput to support a particular lifestyle that is a higher material standards of living, the further you have to fall. And so the people in our society who are doing it hard, and often they are Maori or Pacifica, but also there's lots of other people, something like before the crisis, something like a third of New Zealand households were experiencing a level of food insecurity, just to give you an idea of how bad that is here. Those people will find it harder structurally because they are already doing it hard in some respects, but also they've got less adaptation to do because they're already doing it hard and they're already struggling, and they already know what it is to economize and to make hard decisions, and to and psychologically I think that they are more prepared in many respects for the descent that we now face than people who just assume that because they've got all these property investments and money invested and all the other things, that they can continue to draw on those and borrow against them and fund these lavish lifestyles that are ultimately, in my view, a real risk to them. It kind of flips the script on the whole woe is the poor, and aren't these billionaires lucky that they can afford bunkers and all the rest of it.
I want to get on to talking about New Zealand and billionaire doomsday bunkers, but before I forget, you might be the perfect person to ask along these lines, a contrast between the position of the United Kingdom and India facing this energy crisis. And
Oh goodness.
Britain has faced problems since being embargoed militarily in World War One and Two.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like by contrast, people think of India as this deprived and chaotic place, but their agriculture has like the largest percentage of the population actually involved in agriculture
Correct.
and
Yeah.
one of the lowest rates of inputs into making that system work.
Yeah.
Whereas the UK still relies massively on imports, and is still in a very vulnerable strategic position in terms of disruption to economic flows.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that when I really got my head around the limits to growth and resource constraints going forwards and the consequent impact on GDP activity, and looked at work that was done around the food footprint of a city, and recognizing that, for example, if you were to try and feed London from the agricultural land around London, you need everything south of Nottingham and everything east of Bristol. It's a massive food footprint for that one city of 15 million people or whatever it is. And at that point I made the decision to leave the UK, because in terms of overall population density relative to the available productive land, I could see the direction that was heading, and particularly given, like you say, the reliance on both imports and also intensive agriculture in country to support that scale of population. I could immediately see that wasn't a future that I wanted to be around to see unfold. Hence me, jumping to New Zealand when I had the chance, because my ex-wife from New Zealand, met her in 2003, and so it was an easy decision for me to come back here. India is a very interesting place. I have only spent a few weeks in India in my life, and it was when in 2003 I went to visit my dad's brothers and sisters who spread out across the Middle East, UAE, India, Malaysia, which is where his dad was. And my dad, although he's Malay from Kerala in southwest India was actually a Malaysian citizen because his dad was manager of a rubber plantation just outside Kuala Lumpur. And so I visited India, and when people talk about India, I kind of feel like you fall into the same category area as when you talk about Africa, which is that you really need to break it down to the individual states and look specifically at their vulnerabilities and strengths.
Yeah, it's 200 nations in a trench coat.
Exactly. And so I can speak a little bit about the state that my father's family is from, which is Kerala, which there's a fantastic talk which I've got a transcript of on my blog by a Malay English or Scottish fellow called Vinay Gupta, who's a futurist that I really admire, and he gave a talk at the Dark Mountain conference called Uncivilization back in 2011, and the talk was called Time to Stop Pretending. And in that, he gave some statistics about Kerala, where he said that basically they live with an ecological footprint of 0.7, so that's well below the global average of certainly OECD nations is usually 2, 3, and then countries like Australia and New Zealand and America is more like 4, 5, right? They have a sustainable ecological footprint in that sense, even though it's a very highly populated part of India, because it has a lot of productive land. It has that sweet spot sort of coastal environment that prevents it from some of the intense heat that affects or afflicts some of the parts of India further to the north, and it's got mountains on its eastern border with cooler regions, and something like 85% of the population is involved in small scale subsistence agriculture, yet they have 95% literacy and a higher a lower infant mortality rate than OECD nations, and potentially also a higher life expectancy. So that's an example. And when you unpick it a bit and understand a bit about the political history of that region, one of the things that the people of that region have done is basically been ungovernable. And what I mean by that is they have a very, very strong political culture. It's very spirited and regularly seems to spill over into violence of various
I
forms.
believe they also have like one of the most functional democracies in the world. Like the
Well,
way the power is distributed across different levels and is
that's
responsive
right.
to the people's needs is
Yep.
remarkable.
Exactly, and so that's exactly it. I believe they're one of the few places in the world to have democratically voted in a communist government, for example. And so there's this very strong political culture there, which I think is a real strength, because it's not allowed the dominant global narrative of capital and mercantilism to take hold in the way that it has achieved elsewhere. And so it is a bright spot in that respect. But India as a whole, again, just the sheer scale of the population and the fact that like most other parts of the world, they've had this period of relative abundance as a result of cheap fossil fuels, and they are strategically vulnerable, I would say, to that as well, because there's more people involved in agriculture. You could see that returns to the land, which is the only real future that we face. I love Jason Bradford's book on that, The Future is Rural, where he basically advocates and sort of argues that we will see a re-ruralization of the world as we run short on cheap energy to keep our cities functional. I think that India is probably better placed to enable that, just because there's already still a significant amount of the population that's involved in that hard work of producing food manually, using relatively little in the way of inputs, as you describe.
To flip it around, do you think Australia and New Zealand are democracies anymore? And how might that change in response to worsening resource limits over time?
I think that the idea of democracy is a noble one. I think it's devoid of a understanding of how humans really act and organize at scale. And I think that if you look at OECD nations generally, notwithstanding all of the paid for, bloviating about, how low our corruption indices are and all that sort of nonsense, the reality is that we are functionally oligarchies. It's $1 one vote, not one person one vote, and that's just the reality of it. I don't particularly sort of rage against that, because it's just the system as it is, and as it as it in a sense must be, because humans are what they are. The idea that we can build democracies that will be responsive to limits and so on, just doesn't understand the level of chaos that, going away from the material throughputs that we've been relying on for so many things that give us our identities, really, people just don't understand, I think. And it's really hard to understand, because it is quite frightening in the short term. And what I've been encouraging people to do recently in that regard is, accept the fact that democracies, or the idea of democracy, is a bit of a myth. And I get a lot of angry reactions when I say that sort of thing. But it just, from my perspective, again, my sort of blunt autistic sort of, just look at the facts, right?
Yeah.
That is how these countries function. And we don't, the people, the broader, citizens of a nation, don't really have access to the levers of power. Governments in New Zealand, going back over the last 4 or 5 terms, have increasingly used this thing called urgency in Parliament to basically ram through undemocratic decisions and policies and legislation. And it's been from both sides of the political spectrum, because left wing, right wing, same bird, and that is just, again, just the reality of it. And so, where we've lost access to the levers of power, I think, is that actually we never really had them. It's been a pleasant fiction that we've allowed ourselves to believe, because the system as a whole was generally delivering in terms of levels of comfort and so on, in a way that we were actually quite comfortable with. And so we weren't, struggling. And why would we complain if we're not, struggling? Like and that's really been the reality of our, supposed democratic systems. And I don't buy, I'm not in saying that we shouldn't aim for, idealistic goals. I think the idea of imagining the project of imagining utopias and kind of aiming towards them is a civilization building skill that humans possess. It's just that we need a utopia bounded by things like entropy, which Samuel Alexander from the Simplicity Institute at Melbourne, I think he is, wrote very coherently about it. It was a fairly dry book. It wasn't that easy to read, but for me it was another one of those light bulb moments where it's like you can actually describe a future in terms of a energy and resource constrained future where people have moved past the initial period of struggle that we're now entering, and again give people something to aim for in terms of a better future. And in that context, I encourage people to think in terms of, when you go to places like India or Africa or parts of South America where people really are living poor, as Vinay Gupta says, collapse from our perspective is living in the same conditions as the people that grow your coffee. That actually, what do people come back and say about those places that they visit? They say they're the poorest people I've ever met, and they're the happiest people I've ever met. And ultimately, we don't recognize, because we're within this system of capitalism and Western democracy in inverted commas, and we don't understand what compromises we've had to make, or there's a narrative that says have been forced upon us by elites, the mercantile class that has dominated public discourse over the centuries. And as a result, we can't imagine a future without these things. I mean, I struggle to imagine it, even though I've been trying to do so, certainly since I read Entropia, but more broadly, there's some quite dystopian visions of the future, like James Howard Kunstler's World Made by Hand series. And, I hope we don't get there. And the reason that I hope we don't get there still is because, there are people out there who are practicing different ways of doing society, doing community, and they're just getting on with it, regardless of the levels of power that they have been denied access to.
One thing I wonder is, uh, I think this is another effect of increasing complexity at the end of a civilizational cycle. As those technologies become more complicated, they become more centralized. So,
Yes.
for example, we've run into problems with oil because so much of it comes from the Middle East, which has created all of these tensions and incentives to, like, do ridiculous things to maintain access to it. But I think what people need to reflect on is if we shift to a photovoltaic future, at the moment, it looks like almost all of that is coming out of China, which is even more concentrated than oil production around the
Yep.
world.
Yep.
And if, some lab somewhere invents a fusion reactor, that's going to be so complicated that there's only really going to be one party which can dole that out to people to, put them in a position where they have to, toe the line. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, like how emerging technologies might intersect with this unfolding decline in fossil fuel. And this is both alternative energy and maybe AI as well, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, so the reality, I think, of sorry, could you just restate that question? My
Well,
mind's gone a bit blank there.
just broadly, how do you
Yeah.
think, like, advances in technology haven't finished just because we've probably reached peak oil? There's going to be some
Yeah.
carryover in, like, AI getting better, in
hmm
various forms of alternative energy technology getting better,
Yeah.
even though
Yeah.
they all still rely on the underlying, coal and iron and concrete
Right.
foundation.
Yeah.
So it can't go on forever, but it looks like we've still got at least another generation or two where there will be, like, amazing technologies appearing, maybe
Yes.
just in the hands of the elite,
hmm
even if they can't be scaled up broad
mm mm
to
mm
everyone, or at least to the first world everyone.
mm.
But yeah, I wonder if you have any sense of or intuitions about how that interplay of a rotting foundation with, like, ever more sparkly stars put on the top of it.
Um, so I think that there's a open question in my mind about how quickly that complexity that the situation that we've got ourselves into has allowed us to achieve, again inverted commas, can be sustained. And if you'd asked me at the start of this year, I was pointing to potential diesel supply disruptions a bit affecting the ability, systems, complex systems at a large scale are beholden to what's known as Liebig's law of the minimum.
Hmm.
And that's basically states that the system can only function at the level of its constraining input, whatever that might be. And it might be that at the moment, for a large part of the world, energy is becoming that constraining input where it hadn't previously. So everyone's focus is shifting to that. But then the second and third order effects of energy disruption on the scale that we've seen affects other systems that, the industrial supply of helium and sulfur and all these other things that, like the likes of Balasmathics at the Honest Sorcerer and Nate Hagens and Simon Michaud and others have been pointing to over the last sort of 5-10 years and really started to sound the alarm on, and that has to some extent unknowable effects.
Hmm.
The like the systems are so complex, and when you start trying to make predictions about how things might unwind, like some what they call them, like a black swan type event, or even I mean I've often said energy resource depletion is like a white swan. It's like, something that you can see coming will have a massive impact, but no one's paying attention to, because it's just not, just compared to the black swan. But anyway, the ability for those systems to sustain themselves, the 7-continent supply chains, as Nate Hagens talks about, which enable all of the inputs required for China to continue making photovoltaics and so on. I don't know how quickly all of that will unwind, and it is possible that you'll get some tech billionaire genius pairing up and creating a Tony Stark-like future. I mean, like those sorts of things aren't beyond the realms of possibility within this broader thing. And actually, there was an interesting book called The Aviator, written by a guy called Gareth Renaudin in New Zealand, which was actually about that sort of future where, broadly, ecosystem collapse and climate impacts were multiplying and scaling, and yet these billionaires had created this sort of closed technological ecosystem that allowed them to create these buffer zones around their residences, and patrol those with semi-autonomous AI weapons and all the rest of it, or fully autonomous AI weapons and all the rest of it. And so that sort of future, I think, is it's certainly not beyond the realms of imagination. I think that the overall global economy has a tipping point somewhere. It clearly does. It's a system. It's a complex system. It has tipping points. How close we are in terms of material flows to one of those tipping points, then having a cascading effect which brings down, a significant part of industrial capacity globally. Back in January, I would have said we probably still have 5-10 years. I think with the level of disruption that this invasion of Iran and the subsequent, disruptions to energy and resource flows has created, it may only be 3 to 5 years at this point. It could be sooner. We don't know, and that's why it's so important at this point, and that's why I've basically put aside a whole load of other bits that I'm supposed to be getting on with and focusing on communicating around this stuff with people. Is just like, look, we actually have a rapidly closing window to make meaningful decisions around things like I said, that decision that the government could make to spend $1 billion on rooftop solar and batteries rather than an LNG import terminal that would provide a level of energy resilience that could support a softer landing in the face of the major, large-scale changes to the systems that we're going to witness as a result of the cascading effects that are already upon us, and how bad that gets and how quickly is an open question. But understanding what I believe I do about that broader energy resource constraint, I don't believe that we'll see a return, and pretty much everyone now is saying this. We won't see a return to how things were before the start of this conflict. The damage that's done and the scale it's been done at on already strained and stretched financial and logistical systems is irreparable in terms of going back to where we were. And this is a big step on that pathway down that is the future, trajectory or glide path for industrial civilization from this point forwards. And whether we hit more turbulence on that glide path or not is not really a question. It's not really a question of whether we hit it. It's a question of when and how bad that will be, and how much it pushes us further down towards that ultimate landing where we say, well, historians will say, looking back on it, that was the point at which industrial society ultimately stopped functioning.
Yeah, it's all about dodging the both the black swans and the white elephants with the limited resources we have left.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Now, we should probably wrap this up. We've been going for quite a while. I had a few other questions, but I wanted to ask the traditional ones I do at the end.
Right.
And one of them might be a bit odd for you. I'm not sure how much you're doing on the front of like your own agriculture and livestock work.
Mm,
And I know you're very busy with your own young family, but
mm,
it maybe just knowing your local bioregion,
yeah.
if you could wave a magic wand and create a new life form, like a crop or a livestock or something that is kind of
Mm,
missing in your local system,
yeah,
is there
yeah.
something that you wish could be brought into existence or that already existed?
Yeah, there is actually, and I've talked about this. There's a lot of talk in New Zealand about predator-free 2050 and the problems that we have with our native ecosystems in terms of um, the introduced species and their impact and so on. So
Mhm.
I would create an apex predator that was selective in its predation to only introduced species that could be, programmed to
Ah.
ignore the indigenous species. Because there is plenty of food in the deer and feral pigs and goats and
Hmm.
tar and all the other things that are out there, and that would rebalance the ecosystem. I think if you look 100 years into the future, past any reasonable expectation of helicopter drops of poison bait for control of these species on a large scale, what we will see is an apex predator emerge. My guess is probably feral dogs become that, because
Mm.
that's the species that we've got most prevalently. And as times get hard and dogs don't get fed, they go looking for food, and that, I mean, you've seen that dynamic all over the world where large feral dog populations exist, and we don't really have that. The farming community, as a general sense, has been quite successful in managing that, mostly in New Zealand.
Mm.
But I think that will become will be where we end up. But yeah, I'd like to see an apex predator that selectively targeted non-native species.
I love that idea. I reckon hybridizing some of the big cats would be a
Mm,
path to that. You want something that's just the right size that it can take on a deer
mm,
without being a worry for a cow.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Interesting, interesting. And the other question I love asking, which might be more relevant for you, if you could create a new cultural tradition or institution for your part of the world, what would you put your energy into?
That's an interesting one. Like I've said earlier in the interview about the civic religion of growth and progress that we currently have.
Hmm.
Um, you know, a I was going to say secular, but that actually isn't the right word. I'd like to see um, a return to a spiritual tradition that um, understands ecological constraints, and we may already have that in indigenous spirituality, Maori spirituality to some extent,
Mm.
but a blending of that with the other extant religious traditions, and the creation of a unified sort of pluralistic, tolerant cultural tradition that embodies an understanding of enough, I guess you'd say, or sufficiency, that allowed us to get away from this idea that growth is good, that we must have more, that it's our right to exploit these systems and all these things that have led us to the point we're at.
It sounds like a synthesis of Western and Maori traditions. It has a great opportunity to bring the best of those together into one, big house.
I believe so, and it's why I'm broadly supportive of the push for Maori to reclaim their cultural identity, and for the language to be taught in schools, and for us to become a bicultural, you know, dual language culture, because actually, it's clear from the academic evidence that I understand that um, talking in a different language alters the way you think. That
Hmm.
actually there's cultural concepts in languages as you immerse yourself in those languages, which can't be explicitly taught and translated effectively in a way that changes people's behavior. And I
Hmm.
think being immersed in cultures, and you kind of see that in some of the stories of the settlers in the US that went native, and the realization they had of how different, and how in many respects more mature and more appropriate to long-term sustainability the indigenous systems were, because they had matured in a system that had constraints. They
Mm.
had not been able to transcend those constraints by leveraging fossilized sunlight, and so they had to be that. And there's some harsh realities with that, in terms of violence and a whole variety of other things, but there's also the reality that those things were probably relatively fringe, and that the Americas, as we understand it now, from this LIDAR surveys of the Amazon and so on, like, supported populations of tens, potentially hundreds of millions of people pre-European settlement, and
Mm-hmm.
that they were living in that way for thousands of years. And notwithstanding the Aztecs and those sorts of cultures that arose periodically within that space, there are ways that humans can organize themselves. The Chinese, if you look back, they've had sustainable dynasties and settled patterns of civilization that persisted over hundreds or thousands of years, whereas most civilizations globally have this sort of cycle of a few hundred years where they basically peak,
And fizzle
consume all
out.
the available
Yeah.
resources in an area, and then collapse.
I wonder if there's a lot of parallels between the history of Japan and the future of New Zealand. So,
Mm,
Japan's a really good example of a recombination nation. They
mm,
are a product of indigenous hunter-gatherers and East Asian rice farmers that kind of
yeah.
blended together into a really distinctive population to mainland Eastern
Mm,
Asians.
mm,
And New Zealand, I think, is at a similar kind of foundation point, that it's got these very disparate Maori, which themselves have a hybrid origin, which goes way further
mm,
back,
mm.
and European influences coming together, and lots of other
Yeah,
things in
yeah.
the mix as well too. And then just that kind of very favorable but very isolated geography could be setting them on a trajectory to become a very distinct people and civilization in coming centuries.
I believe so, and that's ultimately why I chose to relocate my young family here 15 years ago. Is the low population density, lots of productive land, and a relatively benign climate. Although the North Island is being repeatedly hit by tail ends of cyclones and so on.
Mm,
Certainly, where I am in Southland, and the sort of lower South Island, I think has a good chance of achieving sufficient stability through this coming period of disruption, to realize that hope.
mm,
And yeah, that was the strategic sort of decision that I made when I relocated here
mm,
with my
mm.
family.
I think it's a smart move if you're prepared for the risk of collapsing now and avoiding the rush. That
Mm,
Australia and New Zealand, I think we both agree, are candidates for being uh, canaries in the coal mine, literally, that we're
yeah.
likely to deindustrialize before, particularly North America is and China are likely, if they can hold
Mm,
together politically and not tear themselves apart, they could maintain industrialization for longer than we can.
yeah, 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 absolutely.
Mm,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think as well, collapsing now, in terms of suffering some pretty severe energy shortages that force us to change our societal makeup, and doing that ahead of overall industrial output collapse, gives us the ability to potentially draw in some resources still, like
mm,
for example solar panels and batteries, that
yeah.
that will allow us to make that transition in a more orderly fashion than people who get to continue on this path that we're on for as long as they can, and then suddenly hit hit constraints when the global system eventually sort of fails, and you can hit that point that historians will say that's the end of industrial society.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm.
yeah, for sure.
Now, where can people find more of your work? I can highly recommend your Substack.
Yeah, yeah. The Substack is the primary outlet for the writing and sort of public communication I've done. It's interesting, on reflection on this conversation we've just had, a lot of the things that I think that I've talked about in this conversation, and thank you for asking such great questions, are not necessarily things that I've explicitly said. I think there's been a reticence to say some of those things publicly, because it is very challenging subject matter, and I think people weren't generally ready to hear that sort of stuff. So
Mm,
yeah, you're challenging me to sort of put some more stuff out along these lines. I think as well, I post actively on Facebook when time allows, although I've been fairly limited in my activity there just by busyness in other areas in recent times. And yeah, I mean, I'm on X and LinkedIn as well. I find LinkedIn an interesting place because it's a, I mean, yeah, it has its problems, but if you, like all social media outlets, if you curate your feed carefully and selectively unfollow and block the voices that are just not worth engaging with, then you can actually surface some very interesting content. So yeah, I'm on LinkedIn fairly regularly.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, I'll put links to all of those in the show notes so people can follow up and learn more about what you've been doing. But
Thank you.
Nathan, thank you very much for what has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shane. It's like I say, it's been interesting subject matter to cover, and thanks for inviting me on, and all the best for your future endeavours.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to read more of my content, you can sign up for free to my Substack for weekly updates about my experimental farm and various wide-ranging thoughts. A paid subscription will open the archive of past posts, including the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse, and help support everything that I'm doing here. Next week, I talk to ethnobotanist and experimental farmer from Appalachia, Ryan Hewish.